If I wanted to build a career in AI and had I known this,
That's a nice blueprint for how you can actually get into the carbon space as an AI engineer.
me and Sid, we launched India's largest chain of backpacker hostel, two of India's largest chain of backpacker hostels. If you're thinking of building a startup, then this is a $17 trillion market.
Okay, everyone in the chat, guys, Sachin and I go long back. We've known each other for like about 10 years. Both of us met each other at a time when both of us dropped out of college at very different very different colleges, but we just happened to drop out of colleges around the same time. And we joined our first startup together and started learning about digital marketing. That was a thing back then. Digital marketing was like the trend. We rode that wave for a very brief while. We did like an agency stint. Both of us loved traveling, so we worked in the travel industry for like 5 years. And after working together for 5 years, we just parted ways after that, started working on our own things, basically. That's pretty much who Sachin is. I think the conversation will tell you more about who he is and what we have to uncover in this session. Mainly, we're going to talk about, Sachin comes from the climate tech space. He's been in that space for about 5-ish years, and we'll be just uncovering possibilities of how can there be a marriage of generative AI and climate tech, and how hand in hand do these both domains go in order to solve real world problems. And I think there are a lot of real world problems that can be solved because both AI and climate tech are pretty much two of the most trending and out there things, especially in this year as well as last year and a few years to come as well. So very interesting stuff to uncover.
Thanks for that in-depth introduction. I was talking to Sid yesterday, and we were talking about how he is working in the AI space, the core AI space, and I'm working in the core sustainability space. And I personally believe that these are the two biggest global trends at this point in time. So I would like to just begin with that. And I can't even begin to imagine the amount of value that we'll be able to create just by marrying these two domains. And a lot of real impact can be driven. And that's exactly why I'm working in this. So while I was working with Sid, me and Sid, we launched India's largest chain of backpacker hostel, two of India's largest chain of backpacker hostels. It's essentially So while we were working there, we were essentially dealing with a lot of properties, small and medium-sized properties. And I was looking for a real problem statement that I could solve. So then I realized, okay, electricity consumption in small and medium-sized properties is a big chunk of their operating expenditure, which they have to spend on a regular basis, right? So I was like, okay, I know that this is a pain point of these property owners. How can we solve this? Just first principle approach to everything. Then I realized, okay, we can build an IoT solution which is optimized for small and medium-sized properties, which essentially does energy management. But most of the energy management solutions were essentially for large-scale businesses. So yeah, just to cut everything short, we built an energy management tool which collects data from properties, helps them predict which equipment is going to go off when. And using all of that data, we were helping them save a lot of money, around 40% of all the electricity that they were consuming earlier, they were saving. Then I sold that company off and I started Lawsuit, which was my last company. Lawsuit was India's first carbon accounting tool. It's essentially a tool that tells companies what's your carbon footprint. And it's a very complex job to do. It requires like data gathering from a lot of different operations of a company and then putting it together in the form of an analytics platform. And there we use a lot of AI, basically in analyzing graphs and charts and giving insights, actionable insights to the SME. So our focus is SME. We are not going for large scale organization, though we work because we get a lot of inbound of brands like Unilever, Decathlon, and all of that. But with intent, we only go after SMEs, and we are going for solving for SMEs. So yeah, so a lot of them do not have the knowledge or the formal background to be able to, or the time to be able to analyze that graph and derive insight and then integrate it into their strategy. That requires like a lot of expertise. So what we are doing is we're trying to eliminate, we can't say we have done that yet completely, but we are trying to eliminate that sustainability expert that companies currently require in order to analyze that data and take action.
So we've sort of spoken about your background, etc. I think everyone is like up to speed and has context. But in order to go further, I want you to define the climate space because it's a very niche space. Like when most people think about the climate space, they think of NGOs and a very sort of doing it for the good of the planet. There's no money there. That kind of a whole perspective sort of comes into it. But because I've known you and I've known that what you've been doing, I know that there's a whole opportunity that a lot of people don't really tap into, and it's a very niche space. Can you talk about that a bit on what are the kind of opportunities there? What are people in climate tech spaces doing? What kind of companies actually do exist, et cetera, et cetera?
Got it. So first, I would like to say that 70% of all emission comes from businesses. Okay.
On the planet.
On the planet. Okay. So businesses control most of our emissions, but they make us feel guilty.
Saying that we have to reduce our carbon footprint by.
So if you are not changing your lifestyle, it's your fault. Even if you do change your lifestyle, it's a very controversial statement. I'm not saying you shouldn't change your lifestyle. You should do it because it has other benefits as well. But just if you are doing it out of the guilt that, okay, you are not contributing enough, that's the wrong motivation. Most of the emission happens because of companies. And as a result, I'll focus on just that bit. Okay. So for a company to become a net zero entity, so basically the world is aiming to become net zero. And that's the only way we can tackle climate change. Okay. Now, to become a net zero entity, you need to first track to know where do you stand today, just to evaluate. Once you've evaluated yourself, you have to reduce your emissions as a business entity. And then once you have reduced your emission by bringing in different kind of strategies, I'll deep dive into it. Then you have to erase your emissions, remaining unavoidable emissions, you have to erase, okay, by investing in green projects, deforestation, etc. Right. So if you look at this space this way, it becomes very easy to understand it, basically. Track, reduce, erase. So in tracking, there are opportunities like softwares like us, which give carbon intelligence, right? There is opportunity for softwares that facilitate transaction, basically track different activities of a company to give a carbon footprint, right? In reduce, you have all sorts of applications. So once you have tracked and you know that as a company, your carbon footprint is 100 billion tons or 100 million tons. Now to reduce, what will you do? You will employ EV. You will ensure that the waste generated is basically recycled again. All of that, right? So there is a plethora of different applications that a business can adapt in order to reduce their emissions. And then once they have reduced, they can offset. So now within all these, you have a lot of opportunities, right? I was just looking at a software which essentially gives you waste management intelligence. It looks at all the waste that you produce, okay, and then it tells you what is the percentage of that waste that you can reuse, right? And hence reduce the. So there are a lot of AI applications there. Even in tracking, I told you basically risk assessment, predictions about the future, looking at past trends is a great application.
Right.
Deriving insights from existing data and communicating it to the SME in a very simple language is another application. Working with banks to basically look at their entire portfolio and giving them insights that, okay, all your investments in India are going to face a lot of risk with respect to climate in next 10 years. So then they will look at their investments in a different way. So there are a lot of different applications of AI across track, reduce, erase.
Right. So can we establish that everything that happens in the climate tech space is basically centered around how enterprises and these businesses can actually figure out a way in order to bring their carbon emissions down to net zero?
That's the ideal goal, yeah.
That's the central mission that every single climate tech is centered around. Is there any other narrative?
There are narratives. There are a lot of different narratives. But why I'm talking about this narrative is because in 2015, 200 nations from around the world gathered, said
Climate
that the
gods.
global, yeah, it's called the Paris Agreement, which basically established that the world agrees that we have to become net zero by 2050. So that's the common goal of all the governments, right? So it's science backed. It's backed by the topmost scientists in the world. So
Right.
yeah, and heavily vetted, heavily criticized, everything. So I would want to align myself with that goal so that we need to work as a team, right?
Right.
The clock is ticking. We don't understand, so we need
Right.
to work as a team. So that's what.
One question that I have is, so the UN basically announced that as a goal, but not everyone is really tight. Like, sure, you can have prime ministers and presidents of every country going there and saying like, yes, I will agree to this. But they might as well not do it in order to increase profits or whatever it is.
Right.
So how does that ecosystem work wherein they actually incentivize? What is keeping these countries and the companies in line so that they actually follow this?
Awesome. So great question. Amazing question. So basically, what's happening is that it's not just that we've signed that agreement. We are bringing in policies in order to pressurize businesses to start tracking their emissions. For example, India came up with a policy wherein they mandated the top 1,000 companies by market cap to mandatorily track and disclose their emissions. Not only their direct emissions, their supply chain emissions as well, or their suppliers, everyone had to disclose. So now what's happening is that if Reliance has to disclose, then their entire supply chain has to disclose,
Right.
which is having a trick, which is essentially top 5,000 SMEs in India.
Right.
So government is very smart. They are basically putting regulations on the top folks, and that is having a trickle down effect on the economy, and they are not facing the backlash. So that's how you do it. You bring in the regulations, and the regulations are coming in. It's just that it's not
But
common.
what are the incentives for them to actually go and do it? Other than, like there's a stick, but what's the carrot?
Right. So the incentive is you get better loans. You want to say if you are an exporter in India, from 2025, you won't be able to export to a top European client because you don't have your carbon footprint disclosed. It's called carbon border adjustment mechanism. So your EU is saying whatever you whatever you basically export to Europe, you have to pay a tax on it. If you do not, and that basically
That's okay, you can say it.
So that basically fucks up their entire business model. And yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, so now there's incentive. Is there any incentive for the government to implement it?
Yeah, of course, because when you're implementing these strategies, you're unlocking a lot of underlying efficiencies. For example, if you compel companies to operate more sustainably, what will companies do? They will find ways to optimize their energy consumption. What will they do to optimize their energy consumption? They will either bring in better appliances or better machinery, or they will basically switch to a cleaner grid. Okay, so that generates a lot of employment, right? So it has a lot of different things. The pollution.
Okay, so this is basically the big incentive for the government at the end of the day is basically increasing aggregate efficiency.
Right. Increasing aggregate efficiency. That's exactly what they're looking at. And if they bring in these regulations, aggregate efficiency will take care of itself.
Right. Okay. Do you want to give context to what is aggregate efficiency and how that term itself is defined? By the way, guys, this is like one of the best things that I've ever sat through. I've watched it like 3-4 times in my life. There's this video called The Third Industrial Revolution on YouTube. It's a 1.5-hour lecture by this guy. I think everyone should watch it. It gives you a whole new perspective.
Yeah, so I think, Sid, I don't think I'll be able to do justice to what he said, but we can share the link with them, and I can quickly tell about what aggregate efficiency is. It essentially means how efficiently does an entity functions. That's what it essentially means, and it depends on a lot of underlying levers. For example, if 5G comes in, it changes the aggregate efficiency of the entire nation, right? If all cars could become electric, it will change the aggregate efficiency of like everything, like wherever, whichever.
I actually just remembered an analogy that guy used.
Yeah.
So when a plant takes energy from the sun, and there is a certain amount of energy that is stored within the plant, and when I eat the plant, only 10% of that total energy is transferred to me.
Right.
So that's why when I eat an animal, that's basically 1% of the total energy being transferred to me, because that animal eats plants and I'm eating that animal. So there is a lot of energy that is lost in the conversion from one entity to the other. There's a lot of energy that is lost in
From raw
heat.
material to finished product.
Yeah, exactly. So when you minus that, and what remains as the final profit is known as aggregate efficiency, basically.
Right. And the best country to achieve aggregate efficiency is Japan. I think they achieved 11%.
20%.
The peak, yeah, something like that.
Yeah, the best country to achieve aggregate efficiency is at 20%, which sounds very poor if you think about it.
Yeah, so that's what he said. Where is the remaining efficiency lying? So we are basically, we have 80% margin in terms of, so all that efficiency is lying in doing all these kind of things, like changing the underlying infrastructure of the economy.
Going from fossil fuels to renewable resources, etc.,
Right,
etc.
right, right.
Got it. Okay, so I think you've defined the climate tech space quite well. There's one singular problem that everyone is working on solving. There's a huge movement of governments around the world that are actually making it happen, and there are incentives for these companies in order to work towards that problem. There's a market. And I was going through this report.
Comparable to AI, I would say.
Comparable to AI, absolutely. So I read a report by, I think, PwC or one of these big consulting firms, and it's called a global risk report. And were two things on top which really didn't surprise me, but it was good to see them there on top. Number one, so the global risk report is a report that basically tells what are the biggest risks that we as a planet and as a species face across the globe in that particular year. For 2024, the biggest risk was climate change, and the second biggest risk was AI-based misinformation and disinformation. Elections, basically.
Yeah.
Like US is having their elections, India is having their elections, deepfakes are on the loose. People are using voice transformers and stuff like that. Yeah, essentially. And there is no regulation around it right now. There are no bills that are passed. There are only guidelines. So you might as well do it and get away with it right now while you still can, in order to get that power. So that kind of validates that these are two of the biggest problems on the planet right now. Not problems, but also opportunities, since we are looking in the sense of businesses.
Yeah, problem, hence opportunity.
Yeah. So when I think about climate tech, what comes to my mind obviously is a lot of use cases around predictive analysis. I know that a lot of startups are working on predicting the weather better, so that instead of having 3-day accuracy, they can have a better accuracy or whatever it is. Then there is a lot of things around predictive analysis, because what you're dealing with across these companies, even to calculate, like you said, carbon footprints, you're dealing with big data from not only a company, let's say like Reliance, but also all its conglomerates, all its supply chain vendors, everything. This whole thing has to be kind of integrated. And if you want to really move a lever in order to make an impact, you need to suggest a lever that is applicable in the least amount of friction, so that you can get it done fast and it can make that kind of an impact across the entire chain as well. What are the use cases that you see in particular to AI? I've covered it on an umbrella fashion, using bucket terms like predictive analysis, big data, and all that. But can you talk about a few very specific points where generative AI in specific, if at all, can actually help out in this climate tech problems that
So do
you're
you want
solving?
me to talk from problems that can be solved, or do you want me to talk from, okay, let me just do it. Personal carbon footprint tracking is becoming a thing. A lot of people who are climate conscious have started tracking their carbon. And where I see AI can disrupt here is to basically, AI can learn from their habit patterns by integrating with different data. apps that they use. For example, for riding, they're probably using Uber. For shopping, they're probably using Amazon and all of that. And that data can be taken in order to help them take better decision on the go. Right. So that's one application. Just it can be related. It can be like anyone can adopt it. Anyone who wants to live a sustainable life. And then you can build business models around it and figure out how to monetize it. So that's one. Secondly, companies like, for example, a company like Coke. Company like Coke has operations in more than 200 countries, and they have probably 5 lakh suppliers. So how the temperature of the planet changes impacts their supply chain in weird ways.
Oh, okay. Tell me more.
For example, let's assume that Colombia is one of their major consumption country in South America. And because of climate change, they face large scale floods more frequently. As a result, their distribution, like people who will take a Coke bottle and distribute it to that last shop from where the consumer will buy it, that won't happen, right? And that way, since they have global operations, if these events happen more frequently, which they have already started happening, it's going to frequently cost them money, right? So that's a risk. It's going to basically lead to a lot of losses. Now, if you calculate the amount of money you lose for the next 15 years, that amount is only going to increase. So it's like increasing in a compounding fashion.
Yeah.
Like you never know like what happens to Bombay in next 50 years, right? So when these companies sit and they decide a strategy for their company, they're thinking of next 30 years. And for that, they need to be able to do climate modeling, which requires prediction, basically. For prediction, that's where
wow, that is insane. That is insane.
So that tells them that, okay, how should you reallocate your resources such that in next 15 years, you will be able to mitigate the risks that you foresee today. And it saves them billions and billions of dollars. It gives them competitive edge and like almost monopoly-like advantages at times in the long run. So risk assessment is a big thing. So
it basically tells them that, okay, next year there is a high likelihood of a hurricane hitting Indonesia. So what, you should not ship a lot of Coke bottles over there, something like that.
So so that also, that's more very real time, but it does more of like you need certain inputs, right, to be able to plan your strategy for next 5 years. I want to know, okay, I have $100 billion. How do I allocate this $100 billion so that they create value for me for the next 30 years or for the next 20 years, right? So when I'm allocating this resource, I'm thinking about, okay, what all are the risks that are associated if I invest it here. So there you also look at climate related risks. They are extremely important. So yeah, there are companies that just do that. We are one of those companies. Like a part of what we do is that as well, but we do it for smaller entities. There are larger companies that only work with enterprises, only work with a Coke. So like that. So basically you can get a job with these companies, work in their AI teams, and yeah, lots of applications.
Okay, so we've sort of covered, I want to get to that job part after this, but I just want to explore a few more use cases. So predictive analysis, sure. You map out the weather patterns and figure out, and this is obviously more applicable for companies where meteorology or weather patterns have a big impact in some way or the other. And these are probably like FMCG companies or like maybe hardware companies that are like very niche. What else do you see as a marriage of AI and climate tech?
I do not understand it very clearly, but I know as a matter of fact that basically currently we lose a lot of energy by using traditional grid lines. That energy consumption can be optimized a lot using artificial intelligence. That's another application. And another, I said, waste management. So in waste management, You can identify what amount of waste you can actually reuse so that the amount of waste you release as a company goes down. So yeah, banks use AI to identify which companies to give loans to, right? So basically, using AI, they can study different indicators of a company which are released by companies on their sustainability report. A lot of companies release sustainability report on their platform, like or most of European companies and a large chunk of Indian companies release their sustainability report. So banks can basically read these sustainability reports better with AI and take better decisions on who to give loans to, right? So in banking, that is the application. Uh, so yeah, like in manufacturing, you can do better predictive. Like basically, most of it is prediction.
Right. It's very
Better.
data and handling, interpretation, data prediction, and stuff
Right,
like that.
right. So if you want to predict deforestation, for that, like you said, satellite imaging, there are startups that are giving intelligence based on that. So there are like a Century Plywood. Yeah, ESG is huge in Europe. So yeah, so like a Century Plywood, how do they make money? They make money by giving plies. Plies come from trees. Trees need to be grown, right? So for this company, some sort of a predictive analysis based on climate data, right, or satellite images will definitely help them take better decisions or grow better quality of crops.
Right. So, yeah, everything kind of centers around data and predictive analysis. And I
That's
think a way to think about this is you got to find, and you'd obviously be able to make a huge impact and do something really interesting only if you deal with problems that have a vast amount of data.
right,
Like you need to play around with some sort of a complex problem that looks easy to solve, but isn't that easy to solve in reality, basically.
right. And I would say keep it simple. We have identified a path to the goal, which is net zero, track, reduce, offset. So identify what all are small applications of AI within these buckets and start that way. Like if I wanted to build a career in AI, I would have, and had I known this, it would have made my life easy because now I know, okay, in tracking, what are the different use cases? In reduction,
Right.
what are the different use cases? And within those use cases, then I can look at, okay, what are the small problems out of the 20 things that it does? What are the 5 things that I can do using AI? And that's how you do it. That's how things happen in reality.
Yeah.
That's how things happen. So that's how we can.
That's a great point that you brought up, which is something that I've also realized by exploring generative AI, which is what really everyone thinks that generative AI in itself is the golden goose, which it is in some way. But unless you have some knowledge of the domain, unless you really know the domain inside out, whatever AI that you learn is really pointless.
Yeah,
You need to know where you want to use it, basically.
you need to, yeah, exactly. You need to know what are you trying to do with it. It's just
Exactly.
that. So that is the first thing. So okay, you have the skill set. You know that these are the 3 main buckets. Go through, like, spend a couple of weekends, go through all the different uh, possible problems that you can work on, then identify companies that are working on those problem statements, and then reach out to them and be like, hey, I would want to do this for you. I think that's a better way to go about it rather than yeah.
That's a nice blueprint for how you can actually get into the carbon space as an AI engineer.
Because
What's the
we
state
know
of
that.
companies in India that are in this space? Like, do you see similar companies over here, or how early is India in terms of the climate tech space?
So I would say there is more demand than supply of product of services in the climate tech space.
Right.
So there are companies that are working. One is Nking. It's a good company. There is another company called Updapt. They are also into climate intelligence only. So basically, the demand in India is increasing rapidly because government is bringing in regulations very quick.
Right.
Last year, 1,000 companies were mandated. As a result, 5 lakh SMEs in India have to disclose, which 5 lakh B2B market is a huge market. It's not a, it's a very big market, right? And it's only going to become bigger.
Okay. So I mean, what I understand from this is there's a lot of problems that need to be solved, but not enough solutions around.
Right. So there are solutions as well, but there are not enough people who are picking those solutions and implementing.
Okay.
So there's a lot of white
opportunities
space. There is a lot of white space. If you're thinking of building a startup, this is the space to look at. Because at the end of the day, you can't build a startup in AI. You need to apply it somewhere. So if you apply it in a space, then this is a $17 trillion market in the next 5 years.
Right. Markets, it goes hand in hand with what we spoke about earlier, right?
Right.
Sure, you can build a wrapper and you can make some money for like 6 months, a year, or whatever if you have enough distribution. But if you really want to build a company purely out of AI, then you should get into deep tech. You should, build a foundational model like a Sora or a GPT or something very foundationally deep tech, or something which is robotics or hardware or something like that. Otherwise, all AI is basically like a hammer. It's a toolkit that you can use in order to build something else, like a house or something like that.
And that's the magic. That's when the justice will happen. You understand, when you can actually utilize AI to solve real problems. If I am facing some pain, and if you can solve that pain, if internet was just a couple of websites and nothing else, then it's a waste.
True.
Right. Yeah. So we need to utilize this power to solve real problems. And the most pressing real problem at this point in time is climate change. And I would urge every young person here to definitely explore that space.